The Kremlin walls do not tremble from rockets or explosions, but from something far more lethal to Vladimir Putin's system: the imminent economic collapse. Russia, which for decades presented itself as an energy superpower, now staggers, and precisely China, the supposed unbreakable ally in this no-limits alliance, quietly turns off the tap. What is happening here is not a minor detail, but a major geopolitical earthquake. Chinese banks, once considered Moscow's last lifeline, are increasingly reluctant to carry out any kind of transaction. Credits are blocked, transfers frozen, and entire flows of money stop. This represents an economic sentence that Putin probably did not see coming. For years, the Kremlin sold the image of a fortress of stability, a country where oligarchs enjoyed unimaginable wealth and oil revenues filled state coffers. But today, that facade is crumbling. Supermarket shelves are emptying, while families suffer under the weight of inflation, unemployment, and bills impossible to pay. At the same time, billions of rubles disappear into the black hole of the war machinery, while the population protests silently from their homes. However, the real drama lies not only in money but in the people. Millions of young Russians flee abroad to avoid conscription or lack of economic opportunities. Factories halt their activity due to labor shortages. Even the Russian Ministry of Labor warns that by the year 2030, there will be a shortage of 11 million workers, a figure that threatens the foundations of any national economy. While Moscow desperately tries to fill these gaps with migrant workers, the impact is barely noticeable. Putin's last card, oil and gas, is losing its value dramatically. More than 13% of refinery capacity has been destroyed by Ukrainian drone attacks, and what was once considered a gold mine is running out. This precious resource is becoming a burden, and here appears perhaps the greatest humiliation: China. For years, Putin trusted that Beijing would save him in case of emergency. But the opposite is happening. Out of fear of Western sanctions, even Chinese regional banks are shutting off financial flows. Deals drag on, and payments must be made through complex routes and fictitious structures that not only increase the cost of operations, but also raise risks. The supposed equal partnership alliance reduces to a complicated financial juggling act that exposes Russia's vulnerability. For Beijing, the conclusion is clear. Why invest billions in an unsustainable war economy when Ukraine can destroy the same infrastructure in a single night with a few drones? As Russia sinks further into a dead end, Chinese strategists pull the emergency brake. That growing distance could be the beginning of the end of the Putin era. The consequences of this economic isolation are devastating. While the government in Moscow deals with ever-increasing deficits, military spending soars out of control. Every ruble allocated to anti-tank missiles and drones is a ruble missing from hospitals, schools, and road infrastructure projects. Russia is depleting its reserves at a pace that even worries conservative economists within the Kremlin. Official forecasts worsen month after month. Economic growth contracts. Investments plummet. Interest rates remain high, stifling any private initiative from the start. Consumption stagnates and companies postpone decisions, creating a vicious cycle of decline. Most alarming is that the Russian economy is trapped in a so-called narrow corridor. It doesn't matter if the government raises taxes, prints money, or makes drastic cuts. Each measure ends up causing more harm than benefit. In this context, China's cautious attitude proves to be a fatal blow. If even Beijing avoids getting involved with Russia, why should other countries risk it? International investors flee. Capital moves abroad. Projects are paralyzed. Not even the oligarchs are safe. The elite that once seemed untouchable, flaunting their wealth on yachts and luxury mansions, now face pressure. Companies are nationalized, assets confiscated, and executives disappear without a trace. The case of the gold producer Usar Zoloto, which was expropriated by judicial ruling within days, is just one example. Airports, logistics centers, and even agricultural operations are subjected to wartime economy laws. The message is clear. Private property in Russia is no longer guaranteed. Those who still wish to invest must be either naive or desperate. As the elite panic, the West intensifies pressure. Sanctions against shadow fleets, intermediaries, and financial loopholes are constantly expanded. The goal is to cut Russia's last lifeline, selling oil abroad, importing technology, or protecting its money. Each new round increases costs, reduces income, and isolates Moscow further. In this spiral, China becomes the key factor. Xi Jinping faces a decision fraught with risks. Should he try to save Russia, risking the wrath of Western markets? Or would it be better to let the Kremlin fall and protect his own economy? Beijing is aware that, in case of escalation, Europe and the United States could impose joint tariffs against Chinese exports, which would be a real disaster for a People's Republic so dependent on foreign trade. Nor can an increase in NATO's military commitment in Asia be ruled out. For Xi Jinping, the temptation to keep distance and not be dragged by Putin's fall is very strong. That is why Chinese banks have frozen operations and minimized their financial channels with Russia. They know that Putin's Russia is no longer a reliable partner, but a high risk. As this global balance shifts, the Russian population is the true victim. For the average citizen, the situation is equivalent to an invisible but relentless tax, with the war becoming a constant burden. Food prices soar, rents rise uncontrollably, gasoline becomes more expensive, and even electricity bills hit family budgets hard. Many families postpone buying clothes or furniture, give up traveling, or even essential medicines. The so-called war economy generates jobs, yes, but it produces tanks instead of refrigerators, ammunition instead of consumer goods. Thus, living standards fall rapidly. Inflation devours purchasing power while wages remain stagnant. Surviving becomes a daily challenge, mental fatigue spreads, and despair grows. The cruelest thing is that the Kremlin can prevent demonstrations in the streets, but it cannot stop millions of empty refrigerators and unpaid bills from igniting a silent rebellion inside. At the same time, Ukrainian attacks increase the pressure. Strategic targets, such as refineries or industrial plants in the heart of Russia, are hit with precision. The strike on the Novokubansk refinery, which lost more than 4% of national capacity in a single night, reveals the vulnerability of this supposed energy powerhouse. Repeated drone attacks over 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory send a clear message. Nothing is safe. Neither power plants, nor refineries, nor logistics centers. For those who might support Moscow, especially China, the outlook is bleak. Why invest billions if a swarm of drones can destroy that investment in a matter of hours? This is the core of the current geopolitical dynamic. For Xi Jinping, Putin has ceased to be a guarantee and has become a risk. An unstable Russia could shake the global economic order, block trade, and provoke Western reactions that would severely affect Chinese interests. That is why Beijing seeks to keep its distance without officially abandoning the alliance. A delicate situation that in the Kremlin is perceived almost as a betrayal. Putin finds himself trapped at a complicated crossroads. On one hand, he wants to project strength and autonomy. On the other, he actually depends on an ally who has already abandoned him. This humiliation weakens not only his economic position, but also his political legitimacy. If even China loses confidence, why should Russian citizens continue to believe in a promising future? The result is mistrust, fear, and a slow erosion of the loyalty that has sustained Putin for 2 decades. Meanwhile, internationally, the conviction grows that the Putin era is coming to an end. This decline is manifested not only in the streets but also in the luxurious palaces of the oligarchs who once formed Putin's closest circle of power. Their security is fading. Their companies are nationalized overnight. Their fortunes are frozen. Their names disappear from the public scene. What was once an elite group of untouchable billionaires has become a group of terrified figures, unsure if they will be free or even alive tomorrow. Distrust and fear infiltrate the upper echelons of Russian society, and foreign investors also perceive the risk. Capital flees at an unprecedented speed. Construction projects come to a halt, and long-term plans are put on pause. Russia, a nation of unlimited resources, suffocates inside the cage of its own isolation. At the same time, Western governments intensify their measures. New sanctions target so-called shadow fleets that secretly transport Russian oil, intermediaries in Asia, and complex financial maneuvers Moscow uses to circumvent restrictions. Each round of these penalties cuts new veins of the Kremlin, and meanwhile, the cost of the war skyrockets uncontrollably. Expenses already far exceed income. Reserves are melting away, and projections show Russia has failed to meet its financial goals just months after the start of the fiscal year. For the population, this means that money is not only scarce but also insecure. Banks are reluctant to grant loans. Investing in the future loses meaning, and the government itself tries to raise funds through tax increases and price pressures. However, each of these measures increases pressure on a population already suffering from rising costs. Russia is trapped in a vicious circle that seems impossible to escape. And this is precisely what Chinese strategists observe with acute attention. In Beijing, they know that rescuing Russia would not only be costly but probably futile. Xi Jinping faces a crucial decision: support the decline of Putin's empire and risk Western markets punishing China with strict measures, or leave the Kremlin to its fate to protect its own economy. For a people's republic dependent on stability in its exports and international trade routes, the answer seems clear. The cost of saving Putin is simply too high. That is why Chinese banks are withdrawing from that bet. They are aware that every transaction, every business with Russia is not only under suspicion, but also represents a real threat to China's stability. In this scenario lies perhaps the greatest geopolitical drama of our time. The borderless alliance reveals itself, in reality, as a coalition with very defined limits. For Putin, this means losing his last important card for Russia. Facing isolation, and for the world, it represents a profound shift in the power balance of the 21st century. As this balance of power tilts, uncertainty grows at all levels within Russia. Factories halt production due to lack of spare parts and supply chains collapse. Banks increase obstacles for simple operations. International partners distance themselves, and even small businesses struggle to survive. Daily life becomes a constant crisis. Going to the supermarket ends with half-empty bags and prices that have doubled. Rent consumes a large part of the salary, and it has long been impossible to think about vacations or savings. The psychological pressure is enormous because the war is invisible but felt in the pocket, in heating, in the refrigerator. This silent fatigue could prove more dangerous in the long term than any protest movement. While the Kremlin dissolves demonstrations and imprisons opponents, it cannot prevent millions of people from losing hope in the future day by day. The demographic situation is even more worrying. Today, millions of workers are already missing because young men have been sent to the front or fled abroad. Even the Ministry of Labor acknowledges that by 2030 there will be a deficit of millions of workers. It is a gap that even immigration will not be able to cover. This figure is not just a statistic. It means less innovation, less production, less prosperity. A country that loses its youth also loses its future. At the same time, Ukraine continues its strategy of targeted attacks. Every drone attack on a refinery, every fire in an industrial warehouse, every destroyed communications center weakens Russia not only economically but also symbolically. The message is clear. The war is consuming Russia from within. For China, which depends on stability, this scenario is terrifying. Why invest in a country that is falling apart on its own, and where every dollar could vanish in smoke due to a rocket attack? This logic explains why Beijing has been distancing itself more and more. It is not an abrupt break, but a gradual distancing that Moscow feels as a betrayal. While Xi Jinping calculates coldly, Putin is slowly losing his last base of international support. At the same time that the West closes every gap in the sanctions, the Kremlin becomes increasingly isolated. This isolation is intensified by an atmosphere of fear that reaches the highest spheres of power. Mysterious deaths of businessmen, sudden arrests, and unclear judicial sentences. All this indicates that no one is safe. Even the wealthiest men in the country have become prisoners of a system that only survives thanks to iron-fisted control. But control cannot replace economic stability. Without trust, without legal certainty, and without investment, the Russian economy is like a house of cards that can collapse with the slightest breeze. The bitterest irony is that Putin started this war to expand Russia's influence, but today he is leading his country toward economic irrelevance. Instead of expansion, retreat. Instead of strength, weakness. Instead of pride, humiliation. For many observers around the world, it is clear that we are witnessing the slow but unstoppable end of the Putin era. The crucial question is no longer whether Russia will survive this storm, but how long the Kremlin can maintain the illusion of control. Because a state can withstand years of propaganda, but it cannot ignore empty refrigerators, closed factories, or impoverished citizens. People feel that government promises are worth nothing when money is not enough, when bread is missing, and children have to emigrate. Moreover, they perceive that even China, the supposed close ally, is no longer willing to sustain this collapse. The end of the Putin era is not a single event but a process that manifests day by day in rising prices, falling production, and crumbling alliances. It is an outcome decided not by missiles or tanks, but by the silent yet relentless pressure of economic reality. And perhaps therein lies the greatest humiliation. Putin's system will not fall due to external enemies, but it disintegrates from within, by its own contradictions. The final question for you: will China finally disconnect its support and thereby destroy the base of Putin's power? Or will the Kremlin manage to find one last way out of this deadly dead end?